do want to get to the Jacob Wohl story. You've never heard of Jacob Wohl? Well, you will by the end of today's show. I want to get to all of that, but I have to begin today with the full insanity on display from some members of the hardcore left. There's a lot of talk this week about radicalization and polarization. And the idea is that right-wing radicalization is being led by the right-wing rhetoric at Fox News and the right-wing rhetoric from President Trump. Expressing this viewpoint today is Paul Krugman, who is legitimately one of the worst columnists in America. He has heavy competition over on the New York Times editorial page with folks like Charles Blow, but Krugman is truly an execrable columnist. I usually reserve that word only for Michael Knowles, but it certainly applies to Paul Krugman as well. Krugman has a column today called "Hate is on the Ballot Next Week." And here is what he says. He says, in America 2018, whataboutism is the last refuge of scoundrels, and both sidesism is the last refuge of cowards. So his suggestion here for folks who don't know what these words mean, whataboutism is a kind of newfangled word for you don't want to pay attention to the stuff your own side is doing, so you blame the other side. So if you're talking about President Trump's sexual infidelity, then you say, oh yeah, well, what about Bill Clinton's sexual infidelity? That would be whataboutism. So he's saying that whataboutism is now taking place on the basis of rhetoric. He says, if you hadn't noticed, we're in the midst of a wave of hate crimes. Just in the past few days, bombs were mailed to a number of prominent Democrats, plus CNN. Then, a gunman massacred 11 people at a Pittsburgh synagogue. Meanwhile, another gunman killed 2 African Americans at a Louisville supermarket after first trying to unsuccessfully break into a black church. If he had gotten there an hour earlier, we probably would have had another mass murder. All of these hate crimes seem clearly linked to the climate of paranoia and racism deliberately fostered by President Trump and his allies in Congress and the media. Killing black people is an old American tradition, but is experiencing a revival in the Trump era. That sentence is purely despicable. The idea that killing black people is an old American tradition, but it is experiencing a revival. I assume what he means by that is that slavery and Jim Crow were old American traditions, and that Trump is reviving those, which of course is a complete lie. He continues, he says, when the bombs were discovered, many on the right immediately claimed they were fake news or a false flag operation by liberals. But the FBI quickly tracked down the apparent source of the explosive devices, a fanatical Trump supporter, who many are already calling the MAGA bomber. Well, that would be all of the folks on the left who wish to attribute his actions directly to President Trump. The man arrested at the Tree of Life Synagogue, Paul Krugman writes, has been critical of Trump, who he apparently believes isn't anti-Semitic enough. But his rage seems to have been fueled by conspiracy theories being systematically spread by Trump supporters that claim that Jewish financiers are bringing brown people into America to displace whites. So here's when he gets to the point. He says, how are Trump apologists dealing with this ugly picture? Partly through denial, pretending not to see any link between hateful rhetoric and hate crimes, but also through attempts to spread the blame by claiming the Democrats are just as bad, if not worse. Trump supporters try to kill his critics, while some Trump opponents have yelled at politicians in restaurants. Now, I know you're sitting there, you're yelling at your phone, you're yelling at your car radio, you're saying, but Paul Krugman, it's not just that Democrats have engaged in screaming at people at restaurants. The Volusia County headquarters of the Republican Party was shot up, right? People shot bullets through the windows a day ago. A Bernie Sanders supporter shot up a bunch of Congress people, including Steve Scalise, whom he nearly murdered. So what are you talking about? But that would be whataboutism, according to Paul Krugman. If you mention that, that is now whataboutism. He says, this whataboutism doesn't stop with equating protests with violence. It also relies on outright lying. And then he talks about Nancy Pelosi. He says, false equivalence, portraying the parties as symmetric, even when they clearly aren't, has long been the norm among self-proclaimed centrists and some influential media figures. It's a stance that has hugely benefited the GOP, as it has increasingly become the party of right-wing extremists. You might have thought that the horrifying events of recent days would finally break the norm, but you would have been wrong. Both sidesism, it turns out, is a fanatical cult impervious to evidence. Trump famously boasted that his supporters would stick with him, even if he shot someone on Fifth Avenue. What he didn't point out was that pundits would piously attribute the shooting to incivility, and that Sunday talk shows would feature Fifth Avenue shooting advocates and give them a respectful hearing. This needs to stop, and those who keep practicing both sidesism need to be shamed. At this point, pretending that both sides are equally to blame or attributing political violence to spreading hatred without identifying who's responsible for that spread is a form of deep cowardice. The fact is that one side of the political spectrum, says Paul Krugman, is peddling hatred, while the other isn't. And refusing to point that out for fear of sounding partisan is, in effect, lending aid and comfort to the people poisoning our politics. Yes, hate is on the ballot next week. So it's the Democrats are completely innocent. The Republicans are completely blameworthy for every terrible thing that's been said, leading to a rash of hate crimes. And it's not just Paul Krugman saying this. It's also Don Lemon. So Don Lemon on CNN, a man who you recall defended Antifa in recent weeks, he went on his show with Chris Cuomo. The worst segments on CNN are always Don Lemon with Chris Cuomo. They're always just the worst. Because, again, it looks like it's just two blocks of wood clonking each other. But here's Don Lemon talking about he doesn't see Democrats killing people over politics. I mean, that's just not something that's, well, actually, let's do this one first. Don Lemon says the biggest terror threat is white men. Listen to his language here. He says, we have to stop demonizing people. We have to stop demonizing people, but white men are the devil. Here is Don Lemon saying the biggest terror threat is white men.
So we have to stop demonizing people and realize the biggest terror threat in this country is white men, most of them radicalized to the right. And we have to start doing something about them. There is no travel ban on them. There is no ban on, they have the Muslim ban. There is no white guy ban. So what do we do about that?
So I've heard that inflammatory rhetoric only is present on the right. And I also don't know whether Don Lemon can even hear the words coming out of his own mouth. He says we need to stop demonizing people. Also, white men need to be stopped. Okay? Well, that's weird. And listen, statistically speaking, the majority of terror killings in the United States over the past years since 9/11 have been perpetrated by white men. That is true. And that is an accurate statement. It is also accurate to say, just statistically speaking, that the disproportionate number of murders committed in the United States are committed by young black men. That doesn't mean that we ought to be targeting young black men or that we ought to be targeting white men. It means that we ought to be targeting criminals. But Don Lemon is fully fine with demonizing an entire segment of the population on the basis of a few fringe actors who commit acts of evil. And then Don Lemon goes even further. Right? He says, I don't see Democrats killing people over politics. Like, that's not a thing that's happening. Which is a weird thing to say a year after somebody shot up a congressional baseball game and nearly killed the House Majority Whip. But here's Don Lemon being an ignoramus.
A right-wing group killed the woman in Charlottesville. This guy is a right-winger who killed the people in the synagogue. The right-wingers sent bombs to CNN and to Democrats. I don't see Democrats killing people because of political. Yeah, there may be Democratic operatives who are out there saying.
Okay, and then when that guy said they tried to, then both Max Boot and Don Lemon went nuts. How dare you say that? The rhetoric of the Democrats is not the same as the rhetoric of the Republicans. Okay, this is the routine that Democrats are pulling these days. Brian Stelter, who's a Sunday news host on CNN, he says, I hope that Fox personalities think about their role in jacking up the climate of violence.
I sure hope some of those Fox hosts, some of those commentators take a moment, take a minute to think about their role in this environment. Hopefully there's some soul searching right now in the wake of this massacre.
Brian, do you have a fever right now? I mean, what are you thinking? What are you thinking? Mm-hmm. They like ratings. They like winning the ratings war. That's what this is about.
And then there's Alison Camerota suggesting that Fox News hosts don't care if people die so long as they get their ratings. Steve Schmidt, former McCain campaign advisor in 2008, who's been making bank off of being the Republican who's not actually a Republican on MSNBC for years, he blames Mark Levin and Rush Limbaugh, and he says they have blood on their hands.
The propaganda industry that she commands with the vile president that she serves, abetted by Mark Levin and Rush Limbaugh and Breitbart and Newsbusters and Judicial Watch and all the rest of them have blood on their hands for the incitements that they have made that have triggered and radicalized these crazy people. It is deliberate.
So we've talked about radicalization, right? We've talked about radicalization, and the left keeps saying it's radicalization of rhetoric on the part of people on the right that has led to this increase in hate crimes. Again, statistically unverified as of yet because we don't have the FBI statistics for this year. They're only done a little bit later. But beyond that, this idea is that it's only the rhetoric of the right that is to blame. And if you mention the rhetoric of the left, then this is whataboutism. It is whataboutism. There are two ways to radicalize folks, and they're interrelated. One is inflammatory rhetoric. Rhetoric is connected with violence because it's connected with action. Now, that doesn't mean that rhetoric is always incitement to violence. That's an actual legal standard that nothing President Trump has said meets. But there's no question that rhetoric and violence, or rhetoric and radicalism, these things are related. But there are two ways in which rhetoric can lead to radicalization. One is radical rhetoric leading to radicalization. The other is gaslighting. And I'm going to explain what I mean by this in just 1 second, because I know that there are people who are listening to this show right now, who are watching this show right now, and they are feeling more angry and more radical after having listened to Paul Krugman, after having listened to Steve Schmidt, after having listened to Don Lemon. I'll explain why that is, and why the left is doing a deep disservice and contributing to a highly ratcheted up, polarized political environment, including inflammatory rhetoric, in just 1 second. First, let's talk about is a schmuck. Okay, when he says that Mark Levin and Rush Limbaugh are to blame for an anti-Semite shooting up a synagogue, Mark Levin happens to be Jewish, by the way. And then Chris Hayes in that same clip comes back and says, oh yeah, and there used to be all these Republicans who used to condemn bad rhetoric, like Mitt Romney and Ben Shapiro. It's like these people haven't listened for 5 minutes to my show in which I condemn bad rhetoric on all sides on a routine basis, like legitimately every day. Every day. But there's a narrative that's being driven here by Don Lemon, a guy who defended Antifa. Right? That only one side of the aisle is responsible, and if you mention the other side of the aisle, this is because you're being dishonest. This is gaslighting. So a lot of President Trump's critics have, in some cases rightly, suggested that President Trump gaslights his opponents. So what he does is he says something that is false. People say that it's false. He says, I never said that. That's not what I said. What I said is something completely different. Who are you going to believe? You or your own lying eyes? Okay, the left is doing that right now. What the left is doing is engaging in inflammatory rhetoric. They are claiming that Republicans across the country are responsible for an anti-Semitic slaying at a synagogue, are responsible for a nut job, a whack job in Florida sending pipe bombs to Democratic officials. And then they say, who, us? We're radicalizing people? No, how dare you? How dare you? We're just here calling it like we see it. We're just here being honest about the situation that we face. And at the same time saying, well, no, Democrats have never engaged in violence. Okay, it's not just the congressional baseball shooting, folks. Okay, within the past few years, we've seen riots in Ferguson, Missouri. We saw riots in Baltimore, Maryland. We saw riots in Charlotte, North Carolina. All of those riots were pushed for, were inspired, were justified by a number of Democratic officials, basically saying that the cause that was being rioted about was a just cause. When 5 police officers were shot to death in Dallas a few years ago, President Obama had said a lot of things against the police just before that. Obama wasn't responsible for the shooting, but if we're going to talk about a radical political environment that oftentimes is involved with raising the temperature so that violence breaks out, to ignore all of this is just ignorant. And not only ignorant, it's a deliberate attempt to drive you nuts. It's a deliberate attempt to raise the temperature. And that is unsustainable. It's unsustainable. And when Representative Maxine Waters is saying that President Trump should take responsibility for the bomb threats, the same Maxine Waters who called the LA riots an uprising and called for Republican public officials to be confronted in public places, when Julia Jaffe of GQ is blaming President Trump for his extreme rhetoric and then goes on CNN and says that Trump radicalizes more people than ISIS, when Vice President Joe Biden says that Americans should vote for politicians out of character, the same Joe Biden who said that Mitt Romney was going to re-enslave black folks in the United States, of course we feel like we're being gaslit. I have some more thoughts on this in just a second. Of course we feel like we're being gaslit, because we are being gaslit. Okay, the Democrats have suggested that they are responsible for none of what has happened. President Trump is the beginning of time. With President Trump, the universe burst into being suddenly. The Big Bang of politics occurred, and suddenly time began flowing forward. Before, there was no such thing as time. Then President Trump sprung on the scene, and suddenly he was the creator, lord, and master of all bad rhetoric in the United States.